Have you ever felt like your death is worth more to your family than your life? I felt it when my father refused to pay for my pills. He thought he was saving $2,000, but he was actually trying to protect a $5 million insurance policy that voids if my diagnosis becomes official. He let my brain wither for cash. But he forgot one rule: the system always strikes back. I'm going to tell you how his greed made his favorite daughter untouchable to every bank in the world. This is a story of how greed devours itself. During Sunday lunch in our quiet dining room in the foothills of Colorado, I kept my voice casual, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Did you manage to get my prescription?" I asked. The specialist said it was urgent. My father didn't even look up from his plate. He was busy slicing his steak with the clinical precision of a surgeon, or perhaps just a man who believed that if he ignored a problem with enough conviction, it would simply cease to exist. "Oh, we had to use those funds for your sister's new phone," Robert said, his tone dismissive. "Sloane needed the upgraded model for her media projects. It's an investment in her future." I stared at them, the silver fork heavy in my hand. "Right. Then I suppose you didn't bother to read the safety disclosure the pharmacist sent over." My mother, Catherine, paused, her nervous energy radiating off her like heat waves as she fussed with the floral centerpiece. "Disclosure?" she whispered. "What disclosure, Clara?" The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy and suffocating, as if the oxygen had been stripped from the room. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a structural collapse, or in our house, the kind that follows a breach of etiquette. "Clara, don't be so dramatic," Robert finally said, his gaze remaining on his plate. "It's just a prescription. We'll pick it up next pay cycle. Sloane needed that camera kit for her portfolio. It's about her career." "An investment," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Yes," he said, finally meeting my eyes. His gaze was cold, flat, and entirely devoid of empathy. "An investment. Unlike your constant medical overhead." I looked over at Sloane, our family's golden child. At 19, she was a portrait of effortless vitality, completely absorbed in her new device, tilting her head to find the perfect light for a video. She didn't even hear us. She didn't have to. In this house, she was the masterpiece on the wall to be admired and protected. I was the drywall, the studs, and the insulation, necessary for the structure to stand, but entirely invisible until something cracked. I stood up. My legs felt treacherous, a fine tremor running through my hands that I tried to hide by clenching them into fists at my sides. It was a familiar sensation, the physical manifestation of the neurological condition I'd been quietly managing for months. This time, the shaking wasn't just a symptom. It was rage, a cold, crystalline anger that settled in my chest like a stone. "Where are you going?" Catherine asked, her voice reaching a shrill, anxious pitch. "We haven't even brought out the dessert." "I'm leaving," I said. My voice was steady, which surprised me. "And I won't be coming back until you can explain why a piece of plastic and glass is worth more to you than my health." "Clara, sit down," Robert commanded, his voice dropping an octave. "You are making a scene." "No," I replied. "I'm making a choice." I grabbed my keys from the sideboard. They felt unnaturally heavy. I walked toward the foyer, my footsteps echoing on the polished marble. I didn't look back. I knew exactly what I would see: my mother's face twisted in worry for the sake of appearances, my father's expression hardening into fury, and Sloane, still oblivious, still perfect, still the undisputed center of their universe. I got into my car and drove. I didn't head to a friend's house or a park to cry. I drove straight to the pharmacy. The trip was a blur of white lines and red taillights. My mind was racing, replaying the conversation, dissecting it with the cold logic of an architect. We used that money for your sister. It wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a declaration of value. My health, my stability, my very survival was worth less than $2,800. When I reached the counter, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely retrieve my wallet. The total flashed on the digital display, $2,450. It was my entire safety net. Every dollar I'd scraped together from freelance projects, from skipping meals, from walking miles in the wind instead of calling a ride. I swiped the card. The machine let out a sharp, final beep. Approved. I took the small paper bag containing the vials. It felt absurdly light for something that had just cost me my freedom. I walked back to my car and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. I thought about the reglass child syndrome I'd read about in a psychology seminar years ago. The sibling of a child with special needs, or in my case, special status, who was looked through, never at. The child who was expected to be flawless, to be low maintenance, to be invisible so the parents can focus all their light on the one who shines. I had spent 23 years trying to be the daughter who needed nothing. And it had brought me exactly nothing. I was transparent to them. But the thing about glass is that when it breaks, it becomes sharp. I was done being smooth and invisible. I was ready to cut. I started the engine. I wasn't going back to that estate in the hills. I was heading to my studio in Denver, the small space I paid for myself, the one place where I was solid, real, and visible. I had a plan. It wasn't a plan for revenge, not exactly. It was a plan for an audit. A structural assessment of the family I had been propping up for 23 years. I arrived at my apartment and locked the door behind me. The silence here was different. It wasn't the suffocating, performative quiet of my parents' house. It was a silence I had chosen. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up the family's shared cloud drive, the one I managed because my father refused to learn how to organize his own digital life. I began to look, not as a daughter, but as an architect inspecting a building for fatal flaws. And I found them. Cracks in the foundation, discrepancies in the ledgers, money moving in directions it was never meant to go. I saw the withdrawal for Sloan's equipment, $2,800, and right next to it, a transfer from my own meager savings to the joint account labeled utilities. I had paid the electric bill that month. I had paid for the very lights that illuminated their perfect Sunday lunch. I kept digging. I went back 5 years, and there it was, a massive, gaping hole in the family's finances. Over $180,000, gone. The date coincided with a tech bubble that had burst. My father had gambled, and he had lost. I leaned back in my chair, the pieces clicking into place. The tension in the house, the frantic obsession with social standing, the refusal to spend a dime on anything that didn't contribute to the facade of wealth, they weren't just selfish. They were drowning, and they were terrified. I looked at the medication box on my desk. The warning label stared back at me, mandatory state reporting for hereditary conditions. I read the fine print again. Failure to treat. Neglect. Investigation. My phone buzzed. A text from Robert. You're being dramatic. The pharmacist is exaggerating. Come home. We have guests tonight, and you need to handle the catering. I looked at the message. Handle the catering. Not are you okay? Naughty, did you get your medicine? Just a demand for service. A command for the invisible daughter to return and make their lives seamless again. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened a new document and titled it Audit. I began to type. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I wasn't just a glass child. I was the inspector, and I was about to condemn the building. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The anxiety that usually buzzed in my chest like a trapped insect was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I took my medication, the injection stinging as it went in, a sharp reminder of what was at stake. My hand was steady. I pulled up the family calendar. Aunt Julia's birthday was next week. Julia was the sister my father never spoke of, the one who had married a forensic accountant and moved to the city, refusing to play the status games that consumed the rest of the family. I hadn't seen her in years, but I knew where she lived, and I knew she would understand. I printed out the financial records I had found. I printed out my medical history, the diagnosis I had received months ago, and the prescription rejection notice. I put it all in a neat folder. Then I got dressed, not in the soft, blending-in clothes I usually wore to family events, but in my sharpest suit, the one I reserved for client presentations. I drove to Julia's brownstone. She opened the door, looking surprised to see me. She shared my father's features, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Clara," she said. "What are you doing here?" "I need to hire you," I said. "Or rather, I need to consult with you." She looked at the folder in my hand, then at my face. She stepped back and opened the door wide. "Come in." We sat in her living room, surrounded by books and art, a stark contrast to the sterile white surfaces of my parents' home. I laid out the documents. I walked her through the timeline, the lost investment, the years of financial tightrope walking, the neglect, the camera kit. Julia listened without interrupting, flipping through the pages with a grim expression. When she reached the medication warning label, she stopped. She read it, then looked up at me. "Do you know what this means?" she asked. "It means if I don't treat it, the state gets involved," I said. "It means more than that," she replied. "Look at the insurance policy." Julia pulled up a file on her laptop. It was a digital copy of my father's life insurance policy, an old one, taken out decades ago when the world felt more stable. The premiums were negligible, but the payout was massive. Millions. It was the only real asset the family had left, the only thing standing between them and total ruin if Robert's heart finally gave out. "Read the exclusion rider," Julia said, her finger tapping a paragraph in microscopic print. I leaned in. My eyes scanned the legalese until they hit the line. Policy void if any direct descendant is diagnosed with a hereditary neurological condition prior to the age of 25. The room began to tilt. I gripped the edge of the mahogany table to anchor myself. Hereditary. Neurological. My condition. He knew, I whispered. He knew that if I was diagnosed, if it went on my permanent medical record, the policy would be worthless. "That's why he didn't want you seeking treatment," Julia said, her voice turning hard as flint. "That's why he wouldn't pay for the vials. He wasn't trying to save $2,400, Clara. He was protecting $5 million. He was willing to let you suffer, to risk permanent cognitive damage just to secure his retirement fund." I felt physically sick. It wasn't just neglect. It was a cold, clinical calculation. My brain health versus his financial security. And he had chosen the money. And the warning label, Julia continued. The state reporting. If the pharmacy flags this as critical non-compliance, it goes into a central database. A database that insurance companies monitor like hawks. So, by withholding the money for the meds, he triggered the very thing he was trying to hide, I finished. Or he's about to, Julia said. If that flag hasn't hit the system yet, it will by Monday. I looked down at the papers. The evidence of my father's betrayal was methodical, cold, and utterly devastating. What do? I asked. Julia looked at me with a steady gaze. You finish the audit. You take this to them. You show them that the secret is out, and you watch the walls come down. She stood up, walked to her desk, and produced a checkbook. She wrote a check and handed it to me. It was for $5,000. For the medication, she said. And for whatever comes next. You aren't alone in this, Clara. You never were. We let the glass get too thick. Take it. I hugged her, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a world of shadows. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. I felt real. I drove back to my studio with the folder on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. I had the truth now. I had the leverage. And I had a plan. I waited until Sunday, the day of the mandatory family lunch. The day everyone would be gathered in the theatre of our supposed perfection. I walked into the house, the key my mother had demanded I return still hanging from my ring. The house was unnervingly quiet, the air conditioning humming a low, expensive tune. They were already in the dining room. Clara! Sarah exclaimed, half rising from her chair. We were so worried. You didn't answer any of our texts. Are you ready to apologize for that scene? I walked to the table, but I didn't sit. I placed the folder on the white marble directly in front of my father. I'm not here to apologize, I said. I'm here to update the ledger. Robert looked at the folder, then up at me, his expression tightening. What is this? It's the cost of doing business, I replied. Open it. He opened the folder. He saw the bank statements, the medical records, and the copy of the insurance policy with the rider highlighted in vivid yellow. His face went from flushed to a sickly, ashen grey. He choked out. You went through my private files. I manage your cloud drive, Dad. Remember? You asked me to because you couldn't be bothered to learn the system. This is... He looked at Sloane, then at Sarah. This is a misunderstanding. Is it? I asked. Is the $180,000 loss a misunderstanding? Is the clause that voids your $5 million safety net if I get sick a misunderstanding? Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She looked at her husband. Robert? Is that true? He didn't answer her. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of fear and hatred. You selfish little brat, he hissed. I did this for this family. For you. If that policy is voided, we have nothing. We are destitute. Do you understand what that means? So my health was the price of admission? I asked, my voice rising. My brain was just collateral? It was a minor condition. He shouted, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped harshly against the marble. You could have managed it. A little dizziness, some tremors, or you could have lived with it. But no, you had to be dramatic. You had to see specialists. You had to create a paper trail. I have a degenerative neurological disorder, Dad, I said, my voice finally breaking into a cold, steady roar. If I don't treat it, I lose my motor functions. I lose my cognitive ability. I lose me. And you knew that. You knew it, and you didn't care. I care about keeping a roof over our heads. He screamed. I care about Sloane's future. She has potential. She's going places. You're just an architect. You draw lines on paper. She is a star. There it was. The truth, naked and ugly. I was the worker bee. Sloane was the queen. I was expendable. I was just the structure, and the structure was meant to suffer so the art could shine. Well, I said, my voice dropping back to that cold, steady frequency. I have some news for you. That warning label on the medication box? The one you chose to ignore? What about it? He snapped. It states that critical noncompliance with treatment for a hereditary condition triggers an automatic state audit. Because you refused to pick up the vials, the pharmacy's system flagged the account. It went to the Department of Health yesterday. I received the formal notification this morning. I pulled a heavy envelope from my pocket and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the marble, coming to rest against my father's plate. They've opened an investigation into medical neglect. And because this is a hereditary condition, I turned my gaze to Sloane. They flagged all dependents in the household for mandatory screening. Sloane finally looked up from her screen, her eyes wide and panicked. What does that mean? What are you talking about? It means, I said, looking directly at Robert, that the state is going to test Sloane. And when she tests positive for the gene, which is almost certain, it goes on her permanent medical record. Immediately. Robert sank back into his chair as if he had been struck. The air seemed to leave his lungs in one long, rattling exhale. The insurance company is alerted to state audits automatically, I continued. So, not only is your $5 million policy voided for non-disclosure, but you've just made your golden child entirely uninsurable for the rest of her life. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a glass house shattering, one expensive pane at a time. You ruined us, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. No, I said. You ruined yourselves. I just turned on the lights. I turned and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently, firmly. The click of the latch was the loudest sound in the world. I drove away from the estate, and though I didn't know exactly where I was headed, I knew I was never going back. I was free. I was solid. And for the first time in my life, I was building something that wouldn't break. The next few months were a blur of legal proceedings and heavy silence. The foreclosure notice on my parents' house arrived 2 weeks later. The insurance investigation was swift and brutal. The policy was voided for fraud, leaving them with nothing but the debts they had tried so hard to hide. Robert faced the threat of criminal charges for financial misconduct, but mostly, he faced the reality of ruin. Sloane tested positive for the gene. She was furious, not at the condition itself, but at the blemish it left on her record and the way it complicated her curated life. She blamed me for a week, then she turned her bitterness toward our parents. When the family funds dried up, so did her dreams of a life without labor. She had to find a job, a real one. She moved out shortly after, disillusioned and distant. I stayed in my studio in the city. I took my medication. The tremors stopped, the dizziness faded, and my mind became sharp and clear again. I threw myself into my work. I started a new project, a community center designed with massive walls of glass. But this was reinforced glass, tempered, strong, and unbreakable. One evening, I sat on my balcony looking out at the Denver skyline. I thought about my family, but I didn't feel the old ache of resentment. Hate takes more energy than I was willing to give. I just felt distant, as if they were characters in a book I had finished reading a long time ago. I wasn't a glass child anymore. I was the architect of my own life, and the foundation was finally solid.